students. Welcome to our final segment in our notes for this week's topic, seed plants. And so I want to start off today with a quick illustration of plant taxonomy. And if you look at our chart here, we've been taking a tour through plant taxonomy here with the vascular plants. Remember a few weeks back or a few topics back, we learned about vascular and non-vascular. So you know what vascular is all about, the system of tiny tubes. We've talked a little bit about the plants that don't produce seeds. And this week we've been talking about seed plants. And seed plants are generally divided into the two taxonomic categories of gymnosperms and angiosperms. We've spent a bit of time discussing the differences between the dicotyledons and the monocotyledons, otherwise known as the dicots and the monocots and the dicots. Well, today we're going to start off with the gymnosperms, and more specifically, the four phyla of different kinds of gymnosperms. There are four phyla of gymnosperms that we are going to talk about today. So let's get into it. Beginning with the first phylum called the Cycads. The Cycads, or the Cycads, are tropical palm-like trees, but they have cone-like structures that look like this. There aren't too many of these. Well, there are none of these that grow in New Jersey naturally. You have to go to tropical regions of the world to see cycads. But there aren't too many varieties of cycads. That brings us to the next phylum called the Gingos. The Gingos are usually an ornamental gymnosperm that is used, and here's the deal: the seeds that are produced really stink. Now, this may seem like an oxymoron. An ornamental is usually a plant or a tree that you grow somewhere near you so that you can enjoy its ornamental nature. So why would you plant something near you that potentially stinks? Well, you really wouldn't do that in your right mind. So this brings us to an interesting characteristic of ginkgos and other plants for that matter. Some species or varieties of plants have a male version and a female version. Ginkgos are one such example. If you want to grow an ornamental ginkgo, you would only be planting the male ginkgo plant because they don't produce seeds. Only the female ginkgos do. Now, I remember reading years ago an interesting story, and I can't remember the exact town, but it was somewhere down south. The town leaders decided that they wanted to line their entire main street with ginkgos because, well, they look rather interesting. They have kind of cool leaves, they provide a lot of shade, and they're, well, ornamental plants. And so they spent many thousands of dollars investing in a landscaping company to plant the entire main street with ginkgos, believing that they had planted the male ginkgo plants. Unfortunately, as the next season rolled around, springtime arrived, and they realized a mistake had been made. The flowers came out in bloom, they were pollinated, they matured and produced seeds, and the whole town was shut down because nobody could withstand the tremendous odor from the stinky ginkgo seeds. So let that be a lesson to you. Make sure you know the difference between male and female ginkgo trees, because you would not want to plant a female ginkgo tree near your home, or it might cause some stink. I have another story about ginkgos, by the way. I love this one. I love to share this. Many years ago, my wife and I went over and had dinner with my parents. And my parents were elderly at the time, and they were kind of health food nuts. And my dad in particular, he would have a whole row of pills that he would take, vitamin supplements and medication and a whole host of other ones. And I think at that time he was taking 13 different pills during his mealtime. And he knew that there were 13 pills. But this time that we came over, he was counting his pills and he only counted 12. Now he knew that he was supposed to have 13, but for the life of him, he could not remember which one he was missing. So we got all the bottles out of the cabinet and lined them up and opened them all up to see which pill matches which. And make a long story short, we found the one that he forgot about. It was a dietary supplement called ginkgo biloba. Now, if you know anything about health foods and food supplements, ginkgo biloba is a supplement that some people take to aid their memory. I laugh about that every time I think about it, because he forgot to take his ginkgo biloba, which was supposed to help his memory. I just find that so ironically amusing. Perhaps you don't, so let's move on. All right, so in addition to ginkgos and cycads, we have the most common, the conifers. The conifers are those gymnosperms that we around here are so familiar with. They are the cone-bearing evergreen trees like pine trees and hemlock and spruce and fir. It's these types of trees that we would find growing in a tree farm down the road. Conifers are certainly the most common gymnosperm in our local experience. Next, we've got the Neatophytes. The first G is silent. So the Neatophytes are, I would say, pretty neat, because they have blended characteristics of both gymnosperms and angiosperms. They're kind of a transitional plant. Scientists have found it difficult where to put this particular phylum, because they grow flowers, but they also produce cones. So they have characteristics of both gymno and angiosperms, but botanists have, at least currently, decided to put them in one of the phyla of gymnosperms. So that's where we put it too. So here are the 4 phyla of gymnosperms: the cycads, the ginkgos, the conifers, and the neatophytes. But let's transition now and start talking about angiosperms. We're finishing up here with angiosperms because they are by far the largest plant group in the world. They grow in all environments, from subarctic to tropical and everywhere in between. They are the largest group of plants. And here we see a beautiful picture of sunflowers, a great example of a typical angiosperm. And because they produce flowers, angiosperms are also called, flowering plants. Flowering plants. And look at the variety and diversity of flowers that exist the colors and the shapes. And if you are interested in botany or interested in gardening, you will undoubtedly spend time reading about and looking through pictures of various flowering plants for your flower garden, perhaps. But flowering plants, definitely one of the most beautiful species, beautiful group of animals, I think, on planet Earth, because they're just so, well, colorful and attractive looking. So let's talk a little bit more about flowers, shall we? Flowers, as we know from earlier, flowers contain the reproductive organs of angiosperms. And if we look at this pot of flowers here, and then we zoom in on one of the flowers and notice these structures popping out of the middle of the flower, well, these are the reproductive organs of a flowering plant. So let's explore these reproductive organs and get to understand them a little bit better. And let's begin with the male reproductive structure, which is called the stamen. Now, notice I've underlined the suffix men, stamen. Any idea why I've underlined that part of the word for you? Hopefully you'll do the same and use it as a memory aid. The stamen is the male structure. And on the stamen, as you are labeling the diagram in your notes, let's start at the top with the anther. The anther is the topmost part of the stamen. And whenever I see the word anther, I think of antler. And when I think of antlers, I think of bucks, which are male deer. Only the male white-tailed deer around here grow the antlers. And the antler sounds like anther. That's how I remember that a stamen is the male part of the flower, and at the top of the male part of the flower, we have the anther, which is like the antlers. And then on the anther, we have attached all of the pollen. We spoke at length about pollen in a previous lesson, so hopefully you remember that pollen is the male structure which contains the sperm cells, and that is on top of the structure called the filament. Look at the word again, filament. Maybe underline those three letters, M-E-N, men, stamen, have a filament that attaches the anther containing the pollen. Study that so that you get to know the names of the male parts of the flower. But flowers don't stop there, because flowers have the female parts also. Now, there are some species or varieties that one plant will have only the female parts, one plant will have the male parts. Many flowering plants, however, have both the male and the female parts in the same flower, which is kind of interesting. Some plants can actually self-pollinate or pollinate themselves from the male to the female parts of their own flowers, whereas other varieties or species have to be cross-pollinated, or the pollen from one plant has to be deposited on the female part of another plant. But let's get to the flowering part for the female. It is called the pistil. The pistil is the female part of a flower, and it is made up of various parts, beginning at the top with the stigma. The stigma is sticky, and I always put those words together, the sticky stigma. And there's a reason why the stigma is sticky. Think about the last lesson where we talked about Velcro balls and hay fever and pollen with the little spikes on them. Those little spikes stick to the sticky stigma very well. So when we're thinking about flowering plants and we think about the female part, the pistil, has a stigma on the top which is sticky in order to allow the pollen, which contain the sperm cells, to attach to the sticky stigma. Now, that sticky stigma is on top of a structure called the style. And, females always do things with much better style than guys do. I freely admit that girls have more style than boys, generally speaking. So when pollen lands on the sticky stigma, the sperm cells are allowed to travel down the tube called the style, and they do so in style. And the ultimate goal is for them to go into the ovule where the egg is located, because once that egg becomes fertilized, it will develop into the seed. So the sperm from the pollen has to land on the sticky stigma, travel down the style to fertilize the egg in the ovule, which will, when fertilized, develop into the seed. And because these are angiosperms, they have a vessel around them called the ovary, which, when the ovule becomes fertilized and starts developing into a seed, the ovary begins to develop into the fruit. And that is the word we use. Fruit is a ripened ovary. So the next time you bite into a juicy red apple, keep in mind that you are biting into the ripened ovary surrounding the ovule of the female part of an angiosperm. I know that's a mouthful, so make sure you chew your apple really well. Okay, so that's enough about flowers for the time being, and we're going to move on to our last little segment here of our notes, which will explain that good question I asked you at the beginning of the week. Do you remember that picture I showed you at the beginning of the week with the germinating seeds and the roots went down and the stems went up? And I asked you why? You're about to find the answer to that question now. And it has to do with a word called tropism. Tropism, I think, is a pretty cool thing. Tropism is unique to plants in that it is a plant's response to a stimulus. You know from Unit 1 that all living things respond to a stimulus. It's one of the characteristics of all living things. But plants, when they respond to a stimulus, it's called tropism. And if you look at this little clip that keeps on playing here, just watch this for a moment. This is an interesting little plant, and I'm going to be showing you a video clip of this later on separately. And look at the leaves on that plant. Somebody touches it, and the plant is responding by moving all of its leaves inward. It is so cute. And I'm going to show you a different video which shows numerous examples of this. That is an example of tropism. And it's It's really cute. I can't wait for you to see the other video. There's a couple other examples of tropism here, and the one on the right is probably the most familiar to us. Plants, trees, bushes, shrubs, the seeds that you're growing in your growing pods, they love the light. And if you've ever grown a house plant, you may notice that if you've put it by a window, that plant will always reach toward the light, and it will grow crooked if you don't rotate it every so often so it can straighten out. Maybe you've taken hikes through the forest and you've seen in the middle of the woods trees growing in weird shapes. The reason for that, more than likely, is at some point in the life of that tree, other trees nearby probably fell down and exposed the canopy to have light shining in a certain place that that tree was leaning toward to grow to. And then eventually it started growing straight up to the light again. So tropism can be experienced with light. And as you've noticed with the roots that you've been watching grow in the growing pods, roots always go down. In fact, no matter how you plant a seed, roots always go down, stems always go up, no matter how the seed is oriented. So tropism is a plant's response to a stimulus. Just to give you a quick definition of these two words, which I know you know from earlier in the year, a response can be defined as a reaction to a stimulus. The stimulus is something causing a reaction. They go hand in hand. If I were to throw something at you, let's say my rubber duck scientist, I were to throw this at you, woo! All right, if it comes toward you, you're going to react. If we were doing this in real life, you'd either move away or catch it or bat it out of the way, or you'd blink if you're watching it on the screen. But you are responding to a stimulus because you are alive. If there was no response to a stimulus like that, we might question your state of living. But let's get back into the plant's response specifically. First type of plant tropism is phototropism. Phototropism is a plant's response to light. I've underlined the prefix photo because photo refers to light, like a photograph requires light in order to take it. A photosynthesis is the process that plants use with light to make food. A photovoltaic cell is a device that makes electricity with light. So phototropism is a plant's response to light. Those previous pictures I showed you how a plant responds to light if you've got a house plant near a window. But this happens in nature all the time, like the example of a tree in a forest that I mentioned, or watching a sunflower during the course of the day. Great example of phototropism. If I were to pretend to be a sunflower, I might start the day drooped over and looking sad until the sun rises and the flower of the sunflower brightens and faces the direction of the sun and looks so happy until the sun starts setting again. But sunflowers do a great job of following the sun during the day. All plants follow the sun as well. Whether that obviously or more subtly, plants respond to sunlight. Think about why. That's right. Plants need sunlight to live. That's how they make their food. So it's no surprise that plants respond to sunlight. But here's the next type of tropism, gravitropism. Gravitropism, as the prefix implies, refers to gravity. A plant's response to gravity is called gravitropism. I mean, check out this picture of these roots growing down on this old structure. Looks like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. And again, notice here's a diagram of a plant. The top part is experiencing phototropism. The bottom of it is experiencing gravitropism. Again, gravitropism, a plant's response to gravity. A plant's response to gravity. And again, no matter which way you might orient the seed, no matter how it's put into the soil, the roots will always respond to gravity. Now, we can elaborate on phototropism and gravitropism a little bit more using a couple of adjectives. And the first one is positive. You see, positive tropism is a plant's response toward a stimulus, and negative tropism is a plant's response away from a stimulus. So positive is toward, negative is away. Think about it. If something really positive happened, you'd want to go toward that. If somebody had really good news, you want to go over and hear that news so you get closer to the person. But if you hear something saying really negative and really bad, or something bad is happening, you probably want to go away from it. It might help you remember which one is which. Positive tropism is toward, negative tropism is away. So I want to give you a little quiz here regarding the different types of tropism using the same picture I showed you at the beginning of this topic. Here we have a seed germinating over time. And you can see the changes taking place. The roots are growing down, the stems are going up. I want to ask you some questions and see how you make out. What type of tropism, photo or gravitropism, are the stems and leaves experiencing? Perhaps you said phototropism, the reaching toward the light. What type of tropism, photo or gravitropism, are the roots experiencing as they go down into the soil? Perhaps you said gravitropism. Now let's add those adjectives and see how you might describe things. What type of gravitropism are the roots experiencing? Positive or negative? Hopefully you said positive, because they are growing toward the pull of gravity. Here's another question. What type of phototropism are the roots experiencing here? What type of phototropism? Did you say negative phototropism? Because if you did, you're right, because the roots are moving away from the sunlight. They're going down where it's darker. Think about that in terms of the stems as well, and maybe I'll ask you a question like that on your quiz this week. Hint, hint. So until next time, that's it for today. So bye-bye.